The rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets over Charleston, South Carolina, casting the historic district in shades of gray and silver. Cobblestone streets glistened beneath streetlights. Tourists had long since vanished into cozy inns, and the city seemed to exhale, quiet, breathless, waiting. In a quiet sedan parked on Church Street, Alexandra Pierce sat with both hands on the steering wheel and her eyes forward. The dashboard clock blinked 9:07 p.m. She had just finished a 13-hour deposition marathon in preparation for a federal corruption case that could shake the state's political backbone. For most, that would be enough for a week. For Alexandra, it was Tuesday. To anyone passing by, she was just a black woman in a gray Lexus, probably a local attorney heading home from the office. What they couldn't see, what the badge tucked in her leather satchel didn't show, was that Alexandra wasn't just an attorney. She was a U.S. attorney, appointed by the Department of Justice, assigned to prosecute high-level corruption across the southeastern region. She had spent her career putting powerful men in prison, and she knew firsthand that power always fights back. She took a sip of cold coffee and stared through the windshield, lost in thought. Her phone buzzed, a message from her younger sister checking in. Alexandra typed back quickly. "All good, just heading out. We'll call soon." She didn't get the chance. Blue and red lights suddenly flooded her rearview mirror. No sirens, just flashing lights and a cruiser pulling up sharply behind her, nearly clipping the rear bumper. Her heart didn't race. Her breath didn't hitch. She'd seen this play before, just never from this side of the stage. Still, she did what she always advised others to do. Keep calm, be polite, follow procedure. Hands remained on the wheel, phone placed visibly on the dashboard. She rolled the window down halfway. A white officer approached, mid-40s, stocky, a sneer hiding behind a rehearsed smirk. His name tag read, Lieutenant Raymond Beckett. His hand rested comfortably on the butt of his holstered weapon. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration." No greeting, no explanation. Alexandra nodded. "Of course, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" Beckett barely glanced at her. "You were idling too long in a residential zone. Looks suspicious." She bit her tongue. That wasn't a violation. That was a pretext. But instead of protesting, she reached calmly toward the glove box, moving deliberately. "Slowly," Beckett snapped, leaning in as if she were a threat in a war zone. "Of course," she replied, retrieving her documents with graceful precision. She handed them over. Beckett took them and stepped back toward his cruiser. Moments passed, then more. 10 minutes later, a second cruiser arrived. 2 more officers emerged, both white, both young. They didn't make eye contact with her. Something's off, she thought. This isn't about an idle car. Beckett returned, this time with a different energy, like a man who'd found a spark and wanted to light a fire. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle." Alexandra raised an eyebrow. "For what reason, officer?" He smirked. "Your plates came up with a flagged registration. We'll need to conduct a search." "That's not accurate," she said firmly, but politely. "And I do not consent to a search without a warrant or probable cause." "Refusing to cooperate?" Beckett asked, louder now, so his voice could be picked up on his own body cam. "Step out now." She knew the law, and she knew the game. A refusal to consent could be twisted into suspicion, but she also knew her rights. She slowly opened the door and stepped out, hands clearly visible. The 2 younger officers flanked her like silent shadows. Beckett circled the vehicle once, then crouched. A moment later, he stood and held something aloft. A small Ziploc bag. Pills. "Would you look at that?" he said. "Looks like we've got possession of a controlled substance." Alexandra's blood ran cold. Not from fear, but from fury. Those weren't hers. Her vehicle had been parked in a DOJ-secured garage for 3 days. Every inch of it had been logged, cleared, and sealed. She had her own chain of custody receipts. This was planted, deliberate, calculated. "Sir," she said carefully, "you're making a very serious mistake." Beckett leaned in close. "No, ma'am. You did." And just like that, she was handcuffed. Her wrists pulled back too tight, metal biting into skin. The officers guided her toward the back of the cruiser. She didn't resist, not because she was afraid, but because she had already begun building her case. Beckett hadn't run her name. He hadn't searched the DOJ database. He didn't know who she was. Not yet. Inside the cruiser, as the city lights blurred past, Alexandra stared out the window. Not defeated, but calculating. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person whose voice had been stolen by the very system she had once sworn to uphold. And if they thought she was going to stay silent, they were about to meet the storm. The inside of the Charleston County Detention Center was colder than Alexandra expected. Not in temperature, but in something more visceral. An emptiness, a stillness that vibrated with suppression. She had prosecuted hundreds of cases that began within walls like these, had sat across from men and women shackled at the wrists, accused, exhausted, and often forgotten. But now she was the one behind the steel door. And that changed everything. The processing officer didn't glance twice at her credentials. He didn't ask who she was, didn't wonder why a black woman in a navy blue blazer had the quiet composure of someone who didn't belong in lockup. He just ticked boxes, took her fingerprints, and sealed her belongings in a cheap evidence bag without ceremony. Her DOJ badge disappeared into that bag like it meant nothing. Her phone, her wallet, her notes, all of it cataloged and removed, reducing her to a shell without a title. They placed her in holding cell 3B. The air smelled of mildew and industrial cleaner, like something trying too hard to cover rot. The walls were dull gray, the kind of gray that leached color from your skin, your thoughts, your sense of time. Inside, two women sat opposite each other on cold metal benches, neither speaking, both keeping their eyes on the floor. When Alexandra entered, they barely shifted. Just one more inmate, one more case. She sat down slowly, not out of fear, but calculation. Every move mattered now. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. She knew this part of the system, knew how quickly misinterpretation could escalate, knew that, in places like this, black women weren't seen as daughters, professionals, or protectors. They were presumed problems to be neutralized. "First time?" the older woman asked, her voice gravelly from cigarettes and strain. Alexandra turned. The woman had tired eyes, but not dull ones. She was watching closely. "Yes," Alexandra replied simply. "Doesn't matter who you were outside," the woman said. "In here, you're whoever they say you are." That truth landed hard. Alexandra knew it already. She'd seen it, argued against it, but feeling it for herself was different. It wasn't fear that settled in her chest. It was fury. Controlled, cold, coiled like a spring. At 2:40 a.m., the door clanged open again. A deputy called her name, and she rose without hesitation. They didn't explain where she was being taken, didn't offer counsel, didn't follow protocol. She was led down a hallway that was too quiet, past offices that were darkened, and into a small courtroom that looked more like a storage room turned legal theater. At the front sat Judge William Harrow. She stopped short. He had no right to be here, no legal grounds to preside over a midnight arraignment without her being properly represented. And yet there he sat, calm, collected, and clearly in control of whatever this was. His eyes barely flicked toward her as the deputy pushed her forward. "Alexandra Pierce," he began, voice smooth as lacquer, "you are being charged with possession of narcotics with intent to distribute and resisting arrest. Bail is set at $250,000. Her voice didn't waver. "I haven't been assigned legal counsel. This is a violation of both due process and federal rights." "You've been assigned a public defender," he replied without looking up. "He's running late." She stared at him. "Then you delay proceedings until he arrives. That's the law." A pause stretched. Harrow leaned back slightly, considering her with a condescending calm that betrayed nothing but quiet disdain. "You speak like someone who knows the law," he said. "But this isn't your courtroom anymore, Miss Pierce." Then he brought the gavel down. It was a warning, not a judgment. As they led her out, Alexandra didn't look back. But she felt the weight of what had just happened settle deep inside her. This wasn't about the charges. It wasn't even about her. This was about silencing someone who had gotten too close to something she wasn't meant to see. Back in the cell, the older woman, whose name, she'd learned, was Marla, handed her a small paper cup of lukewarm water without a word. Alexandra accepted it, nodded in thanks. "You were right," Marla said after a long silence. "You don't belong here." Alexandra leaned her head back against the wall. "They're making sure I do." Marla squinted at her. "You a lawyer?" "I'm a federal prosecutor." Eastern District. Marla whistled low. "They really want you quiet, don't they?" "They want me buried," Alexandra corrected. "And why's that?" "Because I was weeks away from indicting Harrow and 3 others. Fraud, embezzlement, obstruction. I'd tracked the money. I had testimonies lined up. Subpoenas drafted. They must have known. Someone inside the DOJ tipped them off." Marla went quiet. Then softly, "You planning on surviving this?" Alexandra looked her in the eyes. "I'm not planning on surviving. I'm planning on winning." That night, sleep didn't come, but clarity did. Every detail mattered now. Every crooked form, every missing document, every illegal shortcut taken by the officers handling her case. It was all part of a larger web. Alexandra didn't need to dig up new evidence. She was the evidence, and she wasn't going to let them dispose of her so easily. At dawn, the cell door opened again. A man in a dark suit entered, not wearing a badge, but carrying authority nonetheless. She recognized the posture instantly. Military trained, calm, director. "Elena Ruiz sent me," he said under his breath. "Hold tight." Then he turned to the guard. "We're moving her." Alexandra stood. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. She had just stepped off the edge of their map. And now, they were on hers. The Charleston County Courthouse stood like a monument to contradiction. White granite gleaming under the sun. Yet inside, shadows clung to every decision ever made within its walls. Alexandra Pierce had walked into courthouses all over the country as an advocate for justice. But this time, she wasn't stepping in with authority. She was walking into a performance. And in this theater, she'd been cast as the villain. The courtroom was packed, not with reporters or bystanders, but with people who had been told exactly what to expect. A disgraced black woman, accused of trafficking, resisting arrest, and being, by implication, everything the system warned about. No press had been notified. No cameras allowed. Everything had been arranged to be quiet, clean, forgettable. She was escorted through the double doors by two deputies who didn't say a word, their grip too tight for someone who posed no threat. Her feet made no sound on the tile, but her presence carried weight. Heads turned, not with sympathy, but suspicion. That was the design. She scanned the room. Near the judge's bench stood Assistant District Attorney Carlton Briggs, a man who built his career on spectacle. His job wasn't to serve justice. It was to convict. Fast, loud, clean. His tie was crisp. His notes were stacked neatly. But his eyes told the truth. He had already rehearsed her guilt. The judge presiding over the hearing wasn't Harrow. Not yet. Judge Eleanor Knox, an older woman with sharp features and a reputation for efficiency, had been brought in for arraignment. Temporary. Tactical. She wasn't part of the corruption Alexandra had uncovered, but she wasn't here to unravel it either. She was a cog, and this machine knew how to keep spinning. The clerk called the case. The words sounded distant, impersonal. State of South Carolina versus Alexandra Pierce. Her name echoed too loudly for a lie she hadn't committed. Ms. Pierce, Judge Knox began, you are charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead? Alexandra's voice was clear. Not guilty. Not a flicker moved across the judge's face. The prosecution began immediately. Briggs stood, clearing his throat as if this were any other case. Your Honor, the state requests denial of bail. Ms. Pierce presents a significant flight risk. Her access to federal resources, ties outside the state, and her current charges make her a danger to the community and a threat to the integrity of the investigation. The courtroom was still. The words were rehearsed, empty of truth, but full of the venom of design. I object, came a calm but firm voice from the back. Heads turned. Elena Ruiz walked in, composed and unshaken, dressed in a dark blue suit that spoke volumes without saying a word. She carried a folder in one hand and a federal authorization letter in the other. Your Honor, she continued, walking to the defense table, Lieutenant Counsel Elena Ruiz, Department of Justice, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I've been assigned as counsel for Ms. Pierce, and I have documentation proving not only her identity and role as a federal prosecutor, but also the severe procedural misconduct surrounding her arrest. Briggs stiffened. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're saying this woman is who? A U.S. attorney, appointed under the Eastern District, with a clearance level that allows access to domestic counter-corruption intelligence, Ruiz stated clearly. She was targeted in retaliation for an ongoing investigation implicating multiple public officials in financial and judicial misconduct. Gasps didn't echo, but there was a shift, subtle, yet undeniable. Judge Knox adjusted her glasses. Do you have proof of these allegations? Ruiz nodded and handed over a sealed document packet. Evidence is included, Your Honor. The arresting officers, Pierce and Lawson, are connected to previous complaints filed by defendants under similar charges. Moreover, body cam footage from the night in question is incomplete. The missing segments were flagged by DOJ systems due to embedded oversight algorithms. We have recovered segments showing Officer Pierce placing the alleged narcotics in Ms. Pierce's vehicle after she was already detained. A tremor spread across the courtroom, faint like the first hint of an earthquake. Alexandra kept her gaze forward. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. This wasn't the time for satisfaction. It was only the beginning. Briggs tried to regain control. Your Honor, these claims are absurd. If Ms. Pierce is indeed who they say she is, then why hasn't this information surfaced sooner? Ruiz turned to him. Because systems like yours are designed to keep people like her buried. But now she has a voice. And more importantly, the law is watching. The judge sat in silence for a moment, reviewing the materials. Her expression remained unreadable, but the weight of doubt had entered the room, and it was pressing hard on the prosecution's foundation. Finally, she spoke. I will not rule on bail today. This case has moved beyond the boundaries of state prosecution. I am ordering a continuance pending federal oversight and internal investigation into the arresting officers and any public officials with potential conflicts of interest. The gavel fell, not with finality, but with shift. As the courtroom emptied, Alexandra stood with Elena beside her. Ruiz leaned close. They're going to try something desperate, she whispered. You just shifted the ground beneath their feet. Alexandra nodded. Then we make them stumble. Because this was no longer just a case. It was a reckoning waiting to be delivered. And Alexandra Pierce wasn't walking into a trap anymore. She was building the fire beneath it. The quiet after the courtroom storm didn't last. For Alexandra Pierce, silence no longer meant safety. It meant planning. As Charleston's old city slumbered beneath a blanket of routine, Alexandra was wide awake, holed up in a small room provided by the DOJ's Internal Affairs liaison, walls papered with case files, timelines, and names that had once belonged to trusted allies. The moment Judge Knox granted the continuance, Alexandra's world shifted from defense to offense. Her release had come with no celebration, no news conference, no public vindication. The system wasn't ready to admit it had tried to swallow one of its own. But that was fine. Alexandra didn't need headlines. She needed results. Commander Elena Ruiz remained her closest ally, but the network was growing. Whistleblowers began to emerge like cracks in a dam. Officers who had worked under Pierce and Lawson contacted federal channels anonymously. Public defenders whispered names and dates. Even one quiet clerk passed Ruiz a flash drive in a sealed envelope after court. What Alexandra saw when she opened the files was worse than what she'd expected. A list. Case after case, predominantly black and brown defendants arrested under almost identical circumstances. Vague traffic stops, found substances, inexplicable body cam gaps, and lightning-fast plea deals brokered before any formal discovery. Names like Marcus Duvall, 19 years old, no priors, charged with felony possession, pled down to resisting. Samantha Ortiz, 42nd nurse, arrested after a routine stop for disorderly conduct, lost her license. Some of them had tried to fight. Most had been worn down by the weight of it all. And presiding over nearly every one of those cases, Judge Harrow. It was Ruiz who said it first. He's not just biased, he's invested. It sounded paranoid. But the more they followed the threads, the more it became undeniable. Real estate, private corrections, police union lobbying. It wasn't just that Harrow handed down unjust sentences. He profited when he did. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. The courthouse wasn't the stage. It was the theater set dressing for a business, a machine that extracted years, futures, and bodies from the most vulnerable and repackaged it into power. Alexandra felt something break in her, not her resolve, but the last vestiges of faith she'd held in the system's spine. She had fought too long believing that exposing truth was enough. But here, truth wasn't hidden. It was simply ignored. "I know where the rot starts now," she told Ruiz, her voice low but certain. They needed proof. Not just enough to tell a story, but enough to bring it down. Enter Special Agent Yara Bennett, Internal Affairs, DOJ, Task Force Alpha. She arrived in Charleston 3 days after the hearing, straight from Washington. In her tailored blazer, and with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, Bennett stepped into Alexandra's operation like she'd been waiting years for someone to call it what it was: organized, legalized abuse. "I've seen towns like this," Bennett said as she laid out documents on the table. "Always the same. Money flows through back channels, bail bonds, court fees, private prison kickbacks. Judges play kingmakers. Police feed the pipeline. And people like us, we're the problem, because we know how to break the gears." They worked in tandem: Alexandra, Ruiz, and now Bennett, scraping years of case law, connecting deposit patterns, tracking appointments, and court scheduling anomalies. Late-night meetings turned into early morning briefings. A paper trail began to emerge. The framing of Alexandra hadn't been personal. It had been strategic. Her federal investigation had gotten too close to sealed subpoenas tied to Harrow's financials. The judge had panicked, and he had used the same mechanism he always had: law enforcement eager for favors, a prosecutor who didn't ask questions, and a system designed to make questioning impossible. And yet, amidst the data and the fury, there was something else Alexandra found: stories, people, lives interrupted. Some were still behind bars, some were out, barely surviving. Others were gone, disappeared under the weight of stigma, or worse, under mysterious incidents after trying to appeal. One case in particular haunted her: a single mother named Adrienne Grant, arrested 2 years prior under nearly identical circumstances. She was defending herself pro se. The public defender dropped the case last minute. Her son had written letters begging someone to look into it. None of them had been answered. Adrienne had died by suicide in jail. No press release, no investigation. Alexandra stared at the photo of Adrienne's boy, 11 years old, face full of quiet rage. This had to end. Not for her, but for them. The plan unfolded with strategic precision. The DOJ team prepared for a sealed motion to unearth Harrow's undisclosed financial records. Bennett tapped into a national task force on judicial ethics. Ruiz coordinated with defense attorneys from every corner of the state who had lost cases under Harrow's gavel. And Alexandra, fueled by a sense of purpose more visceral than any federal case before, began preparing for the confrontation of her career. They were no longer defending innocence. They were prosecuting corruption. There would be no headlines until they were ready. Because in this war, surprise was their only ally. Alexandra sat in the quiet of a borrowed office as dawn began to press against the windows. She held the affidavit in her hand, pages detailing every link in the chain that led from her arrest back to the judge who had signed off on it. She reread the final sentence: "Probable cause exists to investigate Judge William Harrow for conspiracy to obstruct justice, judicial misconduct, and abuse of power under color of law." She closed the file slowly, letting her hands rest against it. Ruiz entered behind her, carrying coffee. wearing the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept, but was wide awake with purpose. "You ready for this?" she asked. Alexandra nodded. "I've spent my life fighting for justice." Her voice was calm. "But now," she said, looking out at the courthouse in the distance, "I'm ready to fight for something even deeper." Ruiz tilted her head. "What's that?" Alexandra turned back, her gaze steel. "Accountability." And for the first time since her name had been called on that courtroom docket, she didn't feel like a defendant anymore. She felt like the prosecution. The morning sky over Charleston was gray, with a muted kind of tension, as if even the weather understood that this day would not pass quietly. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was far more charged than any ordinary hearing. Everyone had heard the rumors, whispers of sealed warrants, anonymous complaints, high-level investigations, but no one knew the full truth, at least not yet. Alexandra Pierce walked through the main doors in silence, flanked by Commander Ruiz and Agent Bennett. She was not in handcuffs today. She wore no badge, no title on her lapel. But the way people parted for her as she passed made it clear. She was no longer the accused. She was the reckoning. In Courtroom 3, the seats filled quickly with reporters, law clerks, public defenders, and a surprising number of everyday citizens who had come not just to witness a legal proceeding, but to see whether justice could still stand on its own feet. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew something was about to collapse. They just didn't know how loud the fall would be. Judge William Harrow entered with the same regal posture he had worn for over a decade. But today, there was something fractured in his composure. He glanced at Alexandra just once before clearing his throat and beginning what was supposed to be a routine motion hearing. But before he could speak again, Agent Bennett stood. "Your Honor, with respect to today's proceedings, the Department of Justice requests immediate suspension of this hearing pending emergency evidence being introduced under federal order." Murmurs rippled. Harrow's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" "On grounds of judicial misconduct, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice," she said plainly, handing over the sealed affidavit and supporting exhibits. Alexandra didn't move. Her hands were clasped before her. Her eyes never left Harrow. The courtroom waited, breath held, as the judge opened the folder. And then it happened. The shift. His face didn't fall, not all at once. It stiffened, resisted, tried to calculate. But the truth has a way of draining even the most practiced facades. The documents detailed everything. Years of orchestrated convictions, sealed financial records, unreported gifts, and a direct connection between his chambers and a private prison company with investments tied to court rulings. Every signature, every case number, every false judgment was now printed in black and white. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrow asked, though the edge in his voice had dulled. He was speaking less like a judge and more like a man slipping from his pedestal. Bennett didn't raise her voice. "You orchestrated the unlawful detainment of a U.S. attorney. You profited from incarcerations you presided over. You manipulated justice to serve personal gain. And now, your time is up." From the back of the room, two federal marshals stepped forward. The silence was deafening. "I suggest you surrender your bench with dignity," Bennett said, "because we're not here to ask permission." The gavel never fell. Harrow rose from his seat, but it was not the rise of power. It was the fall of illusion. The marshals moved in. Cameras clicked. Pens flew across notepads. But Alexandra watched with unflinching calm. He had tried to frame her, tried to erase her, but in doing so, he had exposed himself. As Harrow was led away, Alexandra turned to see the faces behind her. Dozens of people she didn't know, and yet she knew them. Faces of those who had suffered under his rule, who had lost years, lost dignity, lost family. And now they had witnessed something many had stopped believing in: accountability. Later that day, as reporters crowded the steps of the courthouse, Alexandra stepped up to the podium, not as a victim, but as a symbol. She didn't speak long, just enough to be heard. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was about a system that allowed him to exist unchecked for far too long. Justice should not depend on status, or skin color, or silence. We cannot change the past, but we can change what we tolerate moving forward. Behind her, Ruiz placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Bennett nodded from the side, a quiet signal that the battle was over, for now. That evening, Alexandra walked the length of the waterfront alone. The city lights shimmered across the water, and her reflection stared back, no longer shadowed by fear or shame. In her hand was a thin file, her next case, already beginning. Because justice didn't end in a courtroom. It was built, case by case, person by person, voice by voice. And Alexandra Pierce was just getting started. Alexandra Pierce's journey was never meant to become a headline or a courtroom spectacle. She was a woman who believed deeply in the justice system because she had helped build it, case by case, argument by argument, inside the walls of federal courthouses where truth was supposed to be sacred. But when the very system she had sworn to uphold turned its power against her, she didn't crumble. She didn't retreat. She stood taller. She transformed. From a wrongful arrest orchestrated by officers who assumed she was powerless, to facing a judge determined to bury her reputation, Alexandra endured humiliation, injustice, and the cold machinery of a system designed to silence women like her. Yet through every setback, she never surrendered her voice. She used her knowledge, her experience, and her unshakable will to confront a machine that had chewed up countless lives. And when she finally exposed that corruption, when Judge Harrow was led away in cuffs, it wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of restoration, of reclaiming power, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever sat in a courtroom and wondered if fairness still existed. Her victory was never just about clearing her name. It was about rewriting the narrative, about proving that even the most deeply rooted injustice can be shaken when one person dares to fight back with clarity, courage, and truth. She didn't just bring down one corrupt judge. She lit a path for others to walk behind her. She became a symbol, not of perfection, but of resilience, not of power, but of purpose. The lesson from Alexandra's story is clear. The system may be flawed, and power may often sit in the wrong hands, but that doesn't mean the fight is lost. It means the fight is necessary. We all have moments where we can choose silence or action. Alexandra chose action. She chose to risk everything not for vengeance, but for justice. And that choice made all the difference. In today's world, where inequality and abuse of authority still rear their heads in far too many places, Alexandra's story challenges us to be more than bystanders. It reminds us that no matter who you are, your voice matters. Your stand matters. And when you choose to speak up, you don't just protect yourself. You protect everyone who hasn't yet found the strength to do the same. If this story moved you, if it lit something in you, don't let it end here. Like this video, leave a comment about how Alexandra's journey resonated with your own experiences, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter, the stories that inspire, that challenge, that remind us of what's worth fighting for. Because justice isn't just a courtroom verdict, it's a choice we make together every single day.